First thing I'll be looking for is the approval or amendments to the agenda. Moved and seconded. All those in favor? Aye. Next, we'll do our land acknowledgement. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're Mi'kma'ki and the District of Spaganagity, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. East Hants further acknowledges the 50 African Nova Scotia communities whose 400-year history have contributed to the province's culture, history, and legacies. We are all treaty people. First up on the agenda today is a presentation by PVSC. Representing them will be Paul Baisley, PVSC Municipal Account Manager Rod Tremblay, Cheryl Fennerty, Senior Manager of Client Services and Municipal Relations. So I will put it off to you. Go ahead, Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Oh, you turned yourself off. Don't worry, I'll control it from up here. There you go.
Ah, perfect. Red light, green light. Mr. Chair, pleasure to be here again. Your Worship, pleasure to be here as well, and council and staff. And thank you for the invitation again this year. As introduced, Rod and I were here last year, and I'm sure you recognize us. This year we decided that Cheryl Fennerty would come along with us as part of our municipal relations or our client services team. Cheryl and I work directly with Wade and some of the other folks back here, and Rod's more on the assessment and valuation side of things. So we thought we'd bring the team in that deals day to day with a lot of your things at PVSC. So, all right, Rod, let's move along here. I'll go through the first few slides fairly quickly because I know that most of you have seen them before, but there are some new faces here, of course, this year. So we'll talk a little bit about PVSC. We'll talk a little about market value and mass appraisal. Rod's going to talk about the assessment roll for 2024, another sort of unprecedented year. That's 2 in a row and of higher values. And then Rod will talk about the inquiry and appeal period. So about PVSC, again, similar to last year, we're created under the Property Valuation Service Corporation Act. And we're responsible for assessing all the properties in Nova Scotia, some 640 some odd thousand properties this year. We're independent, not for profit, and we are municipally funded by all 49 municipalities across the province. We're governed by a board of directors. Joe Feeney, Deputy Mayor of Mahone Bay is still our chair, and the board's comprised of private, independent sector professionals, as well as some municipal elected officials and some municipal staffers and ex-staffers as well. We have approximately 130 employees working across the province in some 50 communities. The vast majority of them are work from home. We're on that model now, pretty much full tilt since COVID or just before COVID, and it's working very good for us. Next slide there, Rod. So a reminder of what PVSC does and what we don't do. And but what we do is we deliver the assessment roll to all 49 municipalities by December the 1st each year. We're mandated to do that under the Assessment Act. This year, we delivered some 647,000 assessment notices just a couple of weeks ago. Last year, it was just over 630,000 assessment notices. We administer the capped assessment program and the seasonal tourist business designation program on behalf of the Nova Scotia government. It's provincial legislation. We administer it on behalf of the province. What we do not do, or what we do not have the authority to do, as you know, is to set the tax rates. That's under your purview, and I understand that Wade's going to be talking to you a little bit about budgeting tonight. So that's fully the responsibility of the of council. And we do not collect taxes, nor do we create tax policy. Once again, that's yourselves and the province. And we don't provide tax relief. So the Nova Scotia Assessment Act requires that we assess property at market value. There's a couple of key components to market value, or the way that we assess property. The first is that market value is the amount in which, in the opinion of the assessor, would be paid if the property were sold on a date prescribed by the director in the open market by a willing seller and a willing buyer. And that open market part's very important, and the date prescribed by the director is very important, and I'll get to that here in a second. But essentially, those non-arm's length transactions such as family sales, tax sales, distressed sales, $0 transactions are not open market. We don't include those in our analysis, but we do look at every sale. Some 40,000 sales a year we look at, and we filter out the ones that are non-arm's length, and then we will analyze the ones that we use to qualify and set the market trends and the market values. Also, as part of the formula is, the assessment shown on the roll shall be the assessment that reflects the state of the property as it existed on the first day of December, immediately preceding the filing of the roll. So our assessors are out there all through the year, right up to December 1st, collecting data on properties to make sure that we get as much current and accurate information on the properties right up to that date, that state date before the roll gets officially set. Also, we do mass appraisal. PVSC uses mass appraisal to determine the value of all the properties accounts in Nova Scotia. The definition of mass appraisal, the process of valuing a group of properties as of a given date using common data, standardized methods, and statistical testing. So that group of data is important as well. We don't do our appraisal based on single properties or single property sales. We group data together in homogeneous type areas, neighborhoods, in order to determine which way the markets are moving and how the properties should be assessed. So property assessments are based on market evidence. We look backward at the actual sales, the actual market evidence. We don't look forward. We don't prognosticate or try to estimate what the markets are going to do. And PVSC measures market value assessment accuracy, uniformity, and fairness in concert with the Nova Scotia Assessment Act and with in keeping with international standards, such as the standards put forward by the International Association of Assessing Officers. So we certainly use all the international standards and meet the compliances on the roll that we present every year. 3 approaches to determining value. I'm not going to go into them a great deal, but it depends on the property type as to how we value the properties or which method we would typically use. For residential, we use direct sales comparison. So essentially, we analyze the recent sales. As I mentioned, there were some 40,000 across the province, give or take, every year. So we look at those comparable properties to determine the value and adjust for local market conditions. We use the income approach. We determine the income a property can earn after expenses, and we convert the net operating income into a market value. Things such as the larger apartment buildings and retail shopping malls or strip malls that are transacted based on the income potential or the income that they produce. We use the income method. And costs. Typically for more unique properties that there aren't a whole lot of sales for and that, like industrial properties or things such as that, we calculate the land value, the current cost to replace the buildings, then we deduct for depreciation and come up with a cost value. Sometimes we start properties on the cost value, such as with a large apartment building, but as soon as we start getting that income information, once they start to produce an income, we flip it to income and collect that financial data in order to determine the market value on it. All right. So I had mentioned the dates prescribed by the director. These are the important dates. The base date, The base date for the 2024 roll that we just produced is January the 1st, 2023, which is 1 year ago, based on market sales and financial data for the previous year leading up to that January 1st, 2023 date. If there are insufficient sales, we can go back a little bit longer. The international standards allow us to take a look at sales that go back 2 or 3 years. I won't get into that detail too much, but essentially we look at current sales during that 1 year period leading up to the base date, January 1st, 2023. Then there's the state date, which is that physical characteristics or physical state of the property as at December 1st, just before the roll goes out. So market valuation date, January 1st, a year ago. We're looking back, we're looking at actual sales, we're looking at the actual data, and then we're collecting data right up to December 1st. That culminates in the assessment roll, which we sent out on January 8th of this year. And then that begins the legislated 31-day appeal period, and that appeal period will end at midnight on February the 8th of next month. And I should say that you can appeal by mail, by fax. You can take a photo and send it to us by email. So there's various ways to appeal. But if people are considering or thinking about appealing, certainly encourage them to give us a call at the 1-800 number. Rod will display that number a little bit later, and talk to an assessor. We have assessors on hand right now on the phones, 60 different assessors ready to take calls and answer questions on behalf of your citizens. Now I'm going to pass it over to Rod. He's going to take you through the CAPT assessment program, give you a little bit of a refresher, then he's going to go through some numbers for you.
Thank you, Paul. Try and drive my presentation and talk into the mic at the same time. So good evening, Your Worship and councillors. As Paul mentioned, thanks very much for having us and taking the opportunity to allow us to talk a little bit about what we do at PVSC. Certainly always happy to see everyone annually, and thank you, Paul, for the introduction. I'm Rod Tremblay. I'm Assistant Director of Operations with PVSC. So my first slide is often a popular topic, and certainly we'll have some time for questions afterwards, the CAPT assessment program. So PVSC administers the CAPT assessment program on behalf of the Nova Scotia government, Section 45A of the Assessment Act. This program places a cap on the amount of taxable assessment for eligible residential property and how much it can increase year over year. This is determined by the Nova Scotia Consumer Price Index annually in November. The CPI rate for this year, for 2024, is 3.2%. For reference, last year, the CPI was 7.7%. So we've seen a significant reduction in CPI, and this affects, for taxable assessment, the difference that many folks are seeing year over year. This is the difference between an increase that may have been applied last year and an increase that's applied this year. So all of the capped assessments, if there's been no physical changes to those properties and the property continues to be eligible for the cap, have been adjusted by 3.2% for this year's assessment, the 2024 assessment roll. There's a snapshot of one line of a 2024 assessment notice here in the slide, and what you can see is the first column is your assessed value, that $442,500. So as Paul mentioned in this example, that's what we're determining the property is worth as of 1 year prior to the notices going out, January 1st, 2023. So using market data up to that point, based on the physical state of the property as of December 1st, 2023, so just about a month prior to the notices going out. So what that means, if something's constructed over the course of the summer of 2023 and that home or a commercial building is built and finished at December 1st, then we would assess it based on its market value as of 1 year prior. So that's that assessed value. The capped assessment, it's unknown in this example, and we'll keep it straightforward, but that $347,500 is basically a previous year's assessment, so a snapshot of the assessment for this property. We'll assume it's a residential property. And that 347 is a previous year's assessment brought forward by the Consumer Price Index annually. So given the relationship between these two numbers, we'd maybe think it's perhaps about 5 years or so in the difference. And every year, the difference between how the assessments change in one area, or the market impact of the change year over year, the difference between that and the CPI determines how many properties are capped. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The lower of the two numbers is always your taxable assessed value. So in this case, the lower number is that $347,500, and that's the taxable assessment for this property. That's the amount of dollars available to the municipality, and that's the amount that the property owner will have their tax bill calculated on in this instance. So I'll just talk a little bit about assessment roll activity, specifically in the municipality of East Hants over the past year. So we reviewed 384 building permits. The building permit number was down slightly from last year, so we are seeing a little bit of a slowing in building permit activity, specifically year over year. Permits often have a different value, so sort of the impact on overall development is a little bit more difficult to sort of determine. But in terms of total permit number, we did see a lower number in 2023 than we saw in 2022. We reviewed 931 property transactions within the municipality of East Hants. So as Paul mentioned, not all of these would necessarily be used for our reassessment to set the values. We would first review those properties, determine if they represented market, and then use that information to determine the values in the area or the market change year over year. So we reviewed 931 sales, and we had 358 appeals in the municipality of East Hants last year. This is relatively consistent in terms of a percentage of accounts with the rest of the province. So a little bit on the numbers. So total residential assessment in 2023, $2.97 billion, up to $3.71 billion for 2024. So that represents on the residential side a 24.9% increase. Once we take cap into account, so this is considering properties that are capped and available taxable assessment. So what this is doing is taking into account those accounts that only changed by 3.2%. 2023, $2.47 billion increased to $2.75 billion. So that's a 10.9% increase this year. Total commercial was up as well from $289 million to $333 million. So as is consistent with the rest of the province, commercial assessment represents a fairly small portion of the assessment roll within the municipality. As you can see by these numbers, the vast majority of assessed value is on the residential side. And commercial was increased 15.2% overall, 19.8% to taxable commercial when we remove exempt property. And the total assessment roll increased from $3.26 billion to $4.05 billion, as you can see on the slide here. So I'll just talk a little bit briefly about some sector highlights around commercial property. So despite the rising cost of building materials and labor resulting from inflation, as many folks are aware, commercial development did continue both in the municipality of East Hants and the surrounding municipalities, HRM, and the municipalities to the north as well. We saw quite a bit of growth in business and industrial, both in our larger business parks within HRM, so Burnside as well as Bayers Lake, and in some of the satellite business park areas as well, including within the municipality here. Apartments continue to be a strong investment reflective of the very strong demand for housing that we continue to experience throughout the province of Nova Scotia. And both buying and remodeling of existing buildings, we're seeing very, very strong demand, indicating that the owners of those buildings see them as a good investment and expect a solid return. Retail sector saw steady tendency in increased leases, so a little bit more flat on the retail side, still seeing a little bit of recovery from COVID-19, and office buildings remain flat, reflecting the sector's response to shifts in the workplace, mainly due to COVID. So we're not seeing a declining office market for this year, but we are seeing sort of a relatively flat market in that sector. So something I was very involved in this year at PBSC was our response to the natural disasters that occurred throughout the province in the calendar year 2023. So both the wildfires that occurred in the Hammonds Plains area within HRM, as well as the Barrington Lake wildfire, which affected both the municipality of Shelburne as well as the municipality of Barrington. So we worked directly with impacted municipalities to share information and communicate with property owners. We also worked with our provincial partners at the Nova Scotia Department of Natural Resources, as well as the Red Cross, to determine, to understand the physical state of property as of December 1st, so the state date, and if there were any physically affected properties or any damage, we want to be able to accurately reflect that on the assessment roll. And so what we did was work with those municipalities, our stakeholders, and with property owners to understand our best understanding of any damage that occurred on those properties. And we will monitor the impact areas closely for market trends and rebuilding efforts, so to determine if there's any stigma associated with areas that have been impacted, so to the overall market, as well as rebuilding of properties which have been destroyed or damaged by a fire or a flood, to make sure that we're reflecting that information accurately as well. So Paul briefly touched on it already. We are currently in the inquiry and appeal period. So assessment notices were mailed January 8th, 2024. All property owners in the province have a right to appeal under Section 62 of the Assessment Act for 31 days. This is legislated in Nova Scotia. The appeal period ends 31 days later on February 8th of 2024. And assessors are available year-round to answer questions about assessments, but this time of year where we see an increased call volume, we have all of our assessors available every day on the phone, both assessors responsible for residential and commercial property, to answer questions from property owners in a manner where they can discuss whether it's appropriate to pursue an appeal and talk through the details about why a property maybe has changed year over year with the assessed value. So as Paul mentioned, appeals can be emailed, mailed, or faxed. Email is by far the most popular method these days. It just consists of basically taking a photo with your phone or scanning a copy of your assessment notice. What's very important for us is we have to have a copy of that notice signed by the owner of the property. So this is sort of critical in order to allow us to accept an appeal. It has to be signed. There's a spot there where you can fill out the grounds. So tell us a little bit about why you feel the property needs to be appealed or why you disagree with the value. What it really comes down to for us is Section 42 of the Assessment Act, market value. So if you don't think that your property could be sold for the amount that it's assessed for on the date of the assessment, which in the case of this year is January 1st, 2023, then that's the time to maybe give us a call, and we'll certainly talk through why some of the changes occurred and whether it might be a good idea to pursue an appeal. So our contact information is here. Municipal staff have a email address that they can utilize as well. I know we work very closely with the municipality of East Hants on several different municipal inquiries quite regularly. So certainly happy to look forward to continuing to work with the municipality, and property owners can reach us by phone or at inquiry@pvsc.ca. So thanks again for your time, and I'll open up the floor to any questions.
And Mr. Chair, I should just add, when Rod was talking about appeals, appeals across the province, just for your information, are down a little bit this year. Appeals in East Hants are up a little bit this year, and the inquiries that we are getting this year are also down a little bit this year.
Okay, thank you. All right, so first up for questions is Councillor Musa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. Okay, my first question, you mentioned the zero transaction, like the arm's length transaction. So if somebody sell his house to his daughter or son, does that come off the cap or stay on the cap?
If they meet the other eligibility requirements, and it's a direct family member, so child, parent, grandparent, sibling, as specified, that property would continue to be eligible for the cap.
Grandchild.
On the same cap?
Grandchild, yeah, sorry.
On the same cap, like
Yeah,
the cap won't
exactly.
change on
The cap wouldn't change in that scenario, exactly. So if it's a market transaction and that person meets the requirements, they would be capped on that value in the future, but they don't get to keep the old cap. Whereas if it's what we call a family transaction that meets those requirements, and I guess we assume in this example that they meet the other requirements, so they're resident of Nova Scotia, I won't belabor all of the cap requirements, but resident, not registered in the name of a business, and the correct number of units are some of the ones that we look for as well. But if they met those requirements, and it's sort of a transaction between a direct family member, the cap would carry through on those properties.
Okay, and if somebody own property in a company name, I know the commercial, they don't have cap, right? We don't have cap on commercial properties. So if a company own residential property or resource property or something like that, which one is capped and which one is not?
So the answer, if it's owned by a company, none of them would be capped. So the cap legislation is very specific around an individual, and it's been determined that the wording individual basically means a person. So it has to be registered in a personal name. So if the property is held by a numbered Nova Scotia company, limited company, or in the name of a business, it typically will not be eligible for cap regardless of the use of that property. So it still might be classified as residential, but if for some other reason, perhaps related to income tax or something like that, you place a residential property into the name of your company, that property would lose the cap if it was placed into the name of the business. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Yes.
I think the only caveat is mobile home parks. A mobile home park can have a cap.
Yeah. Okay, and my last question, new homes. So if somebody bought a house last year at the high price market, 500,000, let's say. So, and this property is capped, let's say, the assessment is 500 and it's capped at 500. So the next year, will the cap go up or will the cap go down? I know when you buy a new car, as soon as you take it off the lot, you lose $10,000. A house is the same, like, nothing is the same, like, you have scratches here, you have dirty walls, you have something like that. Is there any depreciation you take into consideration when you assess a 2-year-old home? Or, in my opinion, if it comes up to me, I think it should go down a little bit and doesn't go up, like, because they're already paying the most. I don't know if you...
I think, yeah, I'll start, Rod will probably add to it, but it all depends on market value. We assess at market value, so if the market value goes up, and it goes up by more than the cap, you may be eligible for the cap if you meet all the other requirements. If the market value goes down or stays the same, the cap goes up, you may get, you may be taxed on the market value, which would then be reset and become the new cap the following year, so. Depends on market value, which way market value moves and which way the cap moves. They move not necessarily always in the same direction, but most recently, market value's been up high, cap's been down low, so more properties are going on the cap.
I think I'd add that there's nothing in the cap legislation that allows a cap
Yeah,
to go down.
that's true.
But if an assessed value is lower than a cap, that will reset. You'll pay tax on the lower of the two numbers, and that your cap would be based on that number for the future year. So in a scenario where if we determine a dwelling, a residential property to be worth less than its capped amount, then that number would then become the new cap. And in the scenario of new construction, as you've mentioned, it's really the same as any, what we call a market transaction or a market purchase. So in the year following your purchase, the calendar year following your purchase, you typically would not be eligible for cap because that year allows us to have something to base the cap on. So the previous cap is gone. In this scenario, there was no previous cap because it was probably constructed by a builder or something like that, new construction. And so we land at that assessed value, that number, and that's sort of the what we call the cap base year, the year that future caps would be based on. So in the following year, we would add the CPI to that number, assuming there's no other physical changes to the property, compare that to the assessed value, and whichever number was the lower of the two would be the number that property owner pays taxes on.
So if I can continue, if everything, if the CPI go up by 3%, let's say, and it's not CPI is not only about homes. It's about
all goods and services.
all goods and services. So something might put the CPI up, but not the homes. Like the home price stays the same and
you're
CPI
correct.
go up. So if a house, like, I think there should be some depreciation on a new home for people to be able to afford it because they're already paying the max, and to meet the other people that paying for the same house, like they're capped at half the price. I think there should be some leeway for you guys to depreciate that home and bring it lower down, like even if you have to lower the cap.
I think it comes down to market, and all homes are depreciating, like you said, like a vehicle, right?
Yeah.
The physical bricks and sticks of a dwelling is depreciating, but generally property values increase because the land is appreciating faster than the home is depreciating, so the total value is actually increasing, generally speaking. But we have experienced flat markets where, let's say, for example's sake, next year the CPI was 5%, let's say. But the market in that area told us that only 3 or 4% was attributable to the market, then only 3 or 4% would be added to the taxable, right? So that increase would only be what the market tells us it is. So if the CPI exceeds that for some reason, as is possible, especially where we've seen significant inflation in the past couple of years and the CPI larger, especially last year with 7.7 as a result of that, this is just a number that we're provided that we apply to those assessed values. But we're always taking the lower of the two numbers, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And I think the basis is the market value, as Rod said. Remember the definition of market value, willing buyer, willing seller, and it's on a date that was back in the past so that we know actual data. What did it sell for? Was it an open market transaction? And that really takes questions of depreciation, things like that out of it as far, the Assessment Act doesn't talk about assessing based on depreciated value. It's open market, willing buyer, willing seller, market value, and we use that data to tell us what the value is.
Okay. And one more thing. When you say about market value, you compare it to a house, same size, same year built, or the year that the house is built is different. It doesn't make any sense. Like if you have a 2-year-old house here and you want to compare it to another house, so that house could be 5 years old or they have to be same.
I think we would compare it to properties that are reasonably comparable in the market. So what we're trying to do is replicate how a buyer would think of a property, right? So new construction is certainly different than a property that's 8 or 10 or 20 years old, right? So we're always comparing like to like. But we would typically include a reasonable range, right? Where a property that's 2 years old could be reasonably expected to compete with a property that's brand new, generally speaking, because the depreciation is very similar, right? So finishes, the age of things is going to be very close. But we're always looking at like to like within the mass appraisal context and sort of using that to tell us what the market's doing.
And homogeneous geographic areas.
Yeah.
We compare those properties that are as similar as possible in a similar geographic area, and look at which way the market is moving.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilor Musa. Next up to speak, Councilor Sandra Garden-Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a couple of questions. So I know that residents have been concerned about the most recent assessments. As well, I overheard a conversation in my staff room of people comparing their assessments and how much they had gone up, and concerned that if they appealed it, it may go against them. With the 350 odd appeals that you mentioned up on the screen there in our area, do you have those broken down as to when they are appealed, what the results are, whether they go up, whether they go down, whether they stay the same?
I'll defer to Rod.
Certainly. So I think I actually had a look at the appeal numbers for East Hants specifically, and I can say that the amended rate for last year was just under 20% overall for East Hants, so 1 in 5 basically being reduced. The remainder would be either confirmed, so we complete a review of the assessed value of the property. We'd look at some sales. We'd get a better understanding of the physical data, make sure that that's correct for the property. So just make sure that everything we have is correct. Have a look at some comparable sales and determine whether the property falls into the typical range or not. With also appeals are withdrawn. So often we have a chat with a property owner who has appealed. Often if they've sent in an appeal without having a conversation with an assessor first, it may be just a couple of questions. It may be an explanation about the capped assessment program, why assessments could change, and then that appeal just results in a withdrawal. And that's about a third of our appeals province-wide are withdrawn. So a property owner accepts the explanation of the assessor, and there's always the option to withdraw an appeal as well, so that it just basically you retain the ability to appeal annually, but that specific appeal is withdrawn.
Okay, so 20% did you say, so let's go through those numbers then? 20% are reduced, did you say? 20%?
20% were amended in
Amended,
East Hants. Yeah,
okay.
And that's consistent with the province. And the majority of those, I don't have the number of the size of the reductions on hand in terms of those numbers, but the majority would be reductions. So we always have to look at all of the data on appeal and reasons why an assessment can change year over year, reasons why a property might see a different increase than a surrounding property. Each assessment is unique. So we're practicing mass appraisal, but we also collect physical data for properties. So it's often the case that folks look at assessments around them and say, it's a different percentage or it's changed differently. But there's a few reasons why that can be. Sometimes a property's in a different market area, depending on the proximity. So we may be using a different population of sales or different sales evidence to move the assessments. When we change assessments year over year, we have to reflect market value as of that date, January 1st, 2023. And what that means is if a volume of sales come in that give us very strong evidence of where assessments should move in that area, we have to follow that evidence. So that results in changes to assessment year over year. But there's also every property is unique, and how they move or how they trade in the market can differ based on the characteristics of that individual property as well.
Right, okay. So,
Just to add briefly, there are occasions where values go up, but it's very rare. And I know of one that it went up because they felt very strongly that they'd put a lot of renovations into their property and wanted it reflected on their assessment, so they asked
Okay.
us to increase it.
and that's really what I'm inquiring about, when I overhear people saying, they don't want to risk putting an appeal in because they're worried that it's going to end up working against them. I just wondered if that was, if there were considerable numbers that actually happened to.
I would say no.
Okay,
Certainly, it's not something that we are seeking. It's not what the appeal process is designed to do,
Right.
is to go in and increase assessments. However, I would say that everyone should think about that definition of market value, and everyone has a pretty good idea of what their property's worth, generally speaking. And if your assessment, if you feel your assessment is significantly below what you feel your property is worth, regardless of that increase year over year, it's still a question of before, as you're considering an appeal, to think, what's the most reasonable value for this property? What would I expect to sell it for? And that's what the assessment should reflect.
okay, thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Next up to speak, Warden Rolston.
Thank you. Just interesting, the question, when you say it's a family transaction type thing, how do you know if it's been a family transaction? I mean, I'm just curious. Last year, I sold my half of our parents' homes to one of my brothers who owned the other half. So how do you know and he's now living there. Like, how do you know it's a family transaction?
That's an excellent question.
Excellent question.
It can be very difficult to know at times, especially in the case where it's a daughter and his married name,
Yeah.
changed and so on. So it is really incumbent upon the property owner to let us know. We can pick up the ones that we can pick up, the ones that seem very apparent and the assessor knows the area and might have an inclination that it's a family member, but really it's up to the agents who are handling the transaction to make sure that the paperwork is filled out and sent to us. It's a statement of devolution, or is it?
Yeah, we call it a Form 1 internally,
Form 1,
but a notice of transfer. So this form's available on our website to any member of the public or to their legal representative if it's a transaction that's currently underway. Many lawyers are aware of these and proactively send them in as they complete property transactions, and they note there's a cap on the property. They say, okay, we'd better send the Form 1 in. And we have several lawyers, throughout the province who will send these even when it's completely obvious. So it's just removal of a deceased spouse from a property, but the same name is retained, this type of thing. And these are examples of transactions that typically our system is designed to pick up. So if it's the same person to the same person, no money has changed hands, we do review all of those transactions, and we have a metric built into our system to pick those up. But what I would advise is that if there's any doubt, So if the names are different, or if the arrangement of the names is different in multiple owner property, as is often common with cottages, this type of thing, where you might have 5 or 6 owners on the way that it's listed, our system can pick up same name to same name. But anytime it's, for instance, married daughter, this type of thing, where there's a married name involved, it's impossible for us to know that. Where, you know, we see 2 different names, and especially if a monetary value that looks consistent with the market is attached to that, as is often the case, the property might still be eligible for cap, regardless of whether it was sold for market value or not, if the parties are directly related. But we need to know that. So again, as Paul mentioned, really the responsibility of property owners that are party to the transaction, or their legal representative, to get in touch with us and send us in that Form 1. When we receive those, they get reviewed, and what we do is we have the transaction on file for each account. We look at it and say, okay, we know this is a family transaction. We have a way to flag it in our system to make sure the cap carries through for the next year.
And we do get a handful of appeals every year that relate to, why did I lose my cap? I'm a family member. And we look at it, and if it's determined that it's a family member, we'll reinstate the cap under that
Right.
appeal.
For a sale in 2022, it's too late to go back and look at it now.
Correct. Well, if the sale occurred in 2022, it's too late to go back. But it's
But it's not too late to get the cap. Like, I would still, in that
Yes.
scenario, if it's cap eligible transaction, I'd still recommend an appeal, or at the very least a call to
Yes.
discuss it, because we still could potentially bring the cap back for the existing year. There's nothing that we can do for the years in the past, but we can still look at it and sort of consider the what if scenario, where
Yes.
if that cap had been carried through, how would it be calculated?
All right.
And,
Well,
and we
thank
can potentially do that for the existing year, for 2024. And it's kind of a when we became aware type of
Yes.
situation. And again, really, we sort of defer that responsibility to property owners. If it's not immediately obvious, it's very difficult for us to know, of course, as you've mentioned.
Okay, thank you.
we strive to make it correct.
My next question is, and maybe I should know this, I've heard a lot of these presentations over the years, but you talked about the fires and the floods and determining value of a property based on damages or things that might have happened in that time. So I would assume that there are properties out there that the assessment is much lower than it would have prior to these events. Would that be right?
In the event where there's been a total loss, absolutely, right? So certainly if there's been something like a structure fire on a
Yeah.
property where the dwelling is a total loss, then in those cases, again, as we are made aware of these events, so it is, sometimes there are structure fires, especially in rural property where maybe a property's unoccupied or something like that. We need to be made aware that the structure fire
I
has
guess I'm
occurred.
thinking more along the lines of, all right, let's look at the floods, and someone had a home that was badly damaged by the floods and has
Right.
not been able to repair or live in that home. So that home obviously can't be sold now for the same amount it could be sold prior to the flood happening. So would the assessment,
So in that situation, we'd look at the physical data, and again, it's the degree to which we're aware of it. So if folks have been affected, especially with the flooding, it was a very difficult file throughout the province to understand every single house that's been impacted, because often water damage is inside a home, right? So it's not immediately evident from the
Yeah.
outside. So we encourage property owners to get in touch with us, especially this is a great time of year if they've had significant physical damage due to flooding, for instance. That's something that we can absolutely look at. But what we look at in those cases is try and determine if there's still a usable portion of the property. We determine what's the impact of that damage. So we look at a couple of things. What's the cost to bring it back to what it was before? But also, what's assessed there in the first place? So with basement finish especially, from an assessment perspective, we have to make sure that the basement is assessed and that it's correctly assessed, and then make a determination on that basis. Is there any reduction attributable? The same would go for anything related to structural damage. We'd usually look for something in writing from a property owner indicating that the degree to which the property's been structurally damaged, and use that to support an adjustment to the assessment to reflect that physical damage.
I guess that just kind of led into the question that popped into my mind. So what if that has happened and a property is now dropped in assessed value? to below what the capped value is? What happens then?
Great question. So there is Section 45A of the Assessment Act, the cap legislation, which is we apply on behalf of the provincial government, is silent. There's nothing in that legislation that allows us to reduce a cap. Cap is designed to be spike protection. So in years when assessments increase by nearly 25% residentially, as it has this year in this municipality, cap is designed to prevent property owners from seeing that spike protection in 1 year, in tying it to the CPI, which in this year is a significantly lower number in the case of residential property here in East Hants. But when property is lowered for reasons due to physical changes, changes in the market, or a total loss to the property, so some of the fire property in Hammonds Plains, as many of you are aware, there were many total losses experienced there where folks lost the entire home. So those properties would now be assessed for vacant land, basically. So of course, there's a significant reduction to the assessment, and that lower number forms the basis for any future cap calculation, basically, because it's the lower of the two numbers. So if it's gone below the cap, then that number forms the basis for anything in the future. So if there's a reconstruction effort, this type of thing, then we approach that sort of as it happens and determine the physical data at that time.
So a landowner would never be in the position where he would be paying the cap taxes on the capped assessment if it were higher than the
No.
assessment.
So you would
Okay.
never pay on a cap, if a cap calculation for any reason is higher than your assessed value, the system would always take the lower of the two as the taxable assessment.
Thank you.
Thank you, Warden. I just have one question when you talk about fire and rebuilds. So if a home was under the cap, right, in a lot of cases, some of these properties and towards Tantallon and Hammonds Plains, people have been in them for 20 years, so they would have been capped. You know, they probably got a mortgage at the time for $175,000, amortized over 25 years. Once the building's a total loss, when the rebuilding of the house is done, are they still protected by the previous cap, or are they uncapped at the new market value, even though it's a rebuild of the existing home that was capped?
So, do you want me to take this one, Paul?
You can take this one, other than to say that that's an excellent question too, particularly this year.
Yeah, an excellent and highly relevant question that we've been asked frequently, both from folks that have been affected. I was very deeply involved with both the HRM fire efforts on our side to adjust assessments and determine the accurate physical data. We had assessors inspect every property that was identified as being affected by HRM, and likewise in the municipalities of Barrington and Shelburne as well. So all of those properties were inspected to determine physical state. We understand, of course, that many of those folks will rebuild. There was about 30 properties in HRM that had building permits out on them as of our state date, December 1st. Some of those folks were in varying stages of construction, so we would apply sort of a partially completed value. So the question has already come up in 2024 for some folks, and will be much more relevant next year as folks continue the rebuilding efforts in HRM, as well as in Barrington also. With the cap, again, the legislation is relatively silent, on natural disasters and application of the cap in the event of a natural disaster. So a loss that is out of the control of the property owner, basically. So what we've committed to is reviewing the percentage cap advantage. So what that means is, I'll keep the numbers straightforward here, but you have a property assessed at $200,000 and capped at $100,000, you have a 50% cap advantage. So what we've committed to is that when you rebuild, and there's typically a building permit involved, assessor will visit the site to determine the physical changes. In some cases, it will be a very similar dwelling to what was there before, just newer, so smaller depreciation. Would still likely be assessed for a little bit more, but we may be in the ballpark. In some cases, it may be a vastly different home for varying reasons, to do with the availability of supply, to deal with the terms of someone's individual insurance policy. Every situation is unique, and every cap is unique because it's based, remember, on a certain year, a certain base year. So a different cap may result in a different sort of landing pad after everything is rebuilt for every owner. So what we've committed to is to review that percentage cap relationship that existed pre-fire, and we've committed to restoring at least that percentage relationship or greater when the property is reconstructed. So what that means in my $100,000, $200,000 scenario is if that property is assessed now for $400,000 because it's significantly newer, larger, better market appeal than the previous property had, then they would have a cap of $200,000 as a taxable assessment or less. So we've committed to, at a minimum, that percentage, that percentage remaining on the property, or the same advantage going forward. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, because throughout our municipality and every other ones, every year there are home fires where people lose their homes in a fire, right? So, you know, that same scenario happens just with a regular loss of a total loss of
Yes.
a home in any fire, right? So understanding what that is, because for some residents, they bought their house, like I say, for $200,000, right? That's what they mortgaged through the bank because that's what they could afford on their income. Their house gets rebuilt, and all of a sudden they save $600,000, right? And now they're paying that assessment. Well, now they can't rebuild that home and live in it because they can't afford to live there, right? So that's what I'm looking at is there a mechanism and way that if people experience a total loss of their home, that under the assessment plan where they were capped before, that allows them that only CPI increase off of their initial purchase or their initial turnover of the property, through no fault of their own, they're not going to be placed out of their comfort zone to be able to afford their property.
And I think what I'll add too is a couple things just come up, and thanks. It's because it is a scenario that is common throughout all municipalities. I've been looking after what we call fire letters, so revised opinions of value for municipal tax years that are currently underway, where we don't have an instrument to adjust the assessments. We provide a revised opinion to a municipality to determine if the taxes ought to be adjusted, in this process has maybe happened in this room previously around fire destroyed property. Usually it's a one-off, so Hammonds Plains was very unique where we had 137 total losses. So a significant amount of property damage, which had us internally having a discussion on what's the best approach and the most fair approach for property owners within the context of the legislation that we're required to apply, to understand how to apply when a property is rebuilt, and we'll extend that sort of policy to all property that's fire damaged that we are aware of. But I would say we need to be made aware, right? So there's not always a demolition permit. There's not always a request for a fire letter from a municipality. It's not always in the media. And barring those three sort of ways of us discovering a structure fire, we need to know about it. So property owners need to contact us or have the municipality contact on their behalf.
Okay, thank you. No, that answers my question.
Great.
There is a mechanism to try and help as best it can. All right. Oh, Councilor Ryan.
Just kind of follow up on that. So is there a form for that, or is that to let you know of a home that was destroyed in fire? Is there, you're saying contact the municipality or contact us. Is there a form they have to fill out, or is that picked up during if they appeal it?
So I would say we would first, if it was coming from a property owner, we would typically just engage with the property owner, understand the data that's assessed to that property, because every property is unique, and determine if a site visit is required or additional information is required to determine the degree to which a property is damaged. So if a property's been partially damaged, for instance, so structure fire limited to one room or an outbuilding destroyed, this type of thing, oftentimes we need to make a site inspection to determine sort of what's the impact here on the total assessment. If it's a total loss and there's photos in the media indicating that this property has very clearly been subject to a total loss due to fire, then quite often we're comfortable making those adjustments on the basis of the information that already exists.
So what you're saying is there's no form but to contact directly through either you guys directly. So
I would change that a little bit and say they should contact their municipality first. Not all municipalities have a fire policy or a destruction policy. So there are municipalities that don't, but most of them do. So a property owner should contact the municipality and find out if there is a fire policy, and then ideally the municipality contacts us.
Okay.
That's a great point, because there's two, and I apologize, I was sort of answering in the context of the assessment role, but in terms of what we call revised opinion of value, that's based on municipal policy, and as Paul mentions, the best folks to answer that are the municipal, the staff of the related municipality, in this case, East Hants.
Thank you.
All right. Seeing no further questions, I'd like to thank you guys for coming out today. Thank you for the presentation and answering our questions. I'm sure it's definitely been a lot of information that's going to be helpful for all the members of council and all the members of the public that are watching online as well, to help understand how PVSC works and how the assessments are rolled out and what they can do and what they're eligible to do, and contact you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and if questions come out of the discussion afterwards or whatever, certainly direct them to the CAO, and she'll make sure, or to the CFO or whoever, and they'll direct them to us. Cheryl and I will get back to you as soon as we can on them if you do have additional questions, and it's a pleasure, and thank you very much for having us here again this evening.
All right, thank you, and safe travels home.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, first I gotta do regrets about Wayne. So one of the things I forgot to mention at the beginning of the meeting, we do have regrets from Councillor Green tonight, who is under the weather and is unable to attend. Next up on our agenda, we're going to go over the overview of the budget topics, dates, and process with the Director of Finance.
Hey. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So today we're going to go over our budgets for 24-25 and the related business plan document, and I have quite a few slides to go through, almost 50 slides in total. I do want to talk about a few kind of global issues before we get into the nitty-gritty of the slides. So as you can see up here, we have an agenda, which is basically an agenda we hope that will proceed as planned, but it's likely we're going to change things up as we move along in this process. As you can see, we have dates here for tonight, February 1st, February 8th, February 13th, and finally February 20th. And hopefully on the February the 20th, we'll be pretty much wrapped up in this process and ready to make a motion, if not before then. As you can see, there's lots of topics on the agendas. Tonight's operating budget and tax. Thursday nights, we have the grants for community partnership and government grants and bylaw F400. We also have the business plan, and we may have the HR report and we may not. February 8th, capital budget and water utility budget, and February 13th is kind of a grab bag of a whole different bunch of topics. Topics that we've already talked about, I think, on January 16th, some of these, but I'm sure there's going to be other topics that we're going to bring forward and want to discuss and make decisions upon. The opportunity for council to make changes are going to happen towards the end of this process. I think it's very important for the council have kind of an overview of the whole budget process before we start to look at individual decisions on tax rates and changes in those rates. I want to point out that this is a draft document. It's very much, something we were putting forward, but council at the end of the day, may want to make some small changes or some big changes. But it is a draft document, and council will get a chance to look at it. An observation I made, the first year looking at the budget process, that East Hants has a complex, detailed, and significant volume of accounting and budget information. You have 3 budgets: operating, capital, and the water utility budget, and you have a business plan. So you have 4 very detailed budget documents. And there's actually budgets within budgets when you think about the GTR rate. I want to thank Janice and Jordan. Janice and Jordan are the real people that know what they're talking about these taxes, and they've really put a lot of work and effort into it, and I appreciate their work here today. We're going to try to get through this document if we can. I'm not sure if we can or not. I do think it's a great idea if councilors take the time and ask questions as we go along. I know that a lot of you have been through this many times before, and you're very familiar with all these issues. And I have to say that, the document you're going to see tonight is something the vast majority of you have seen similar documents and presentations and budget presentations in the past. And this is not going to be, that different. The numbers are going to change, definitely, but it's very much in line with what you've seen in the past. I will say that some slides do have page numbers, and that's referring to the budget and tax analysis document when you go to it. And let's see, whoops, sorry. Of course, the budget and business plan was...
Sorry to interrupt you there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Would you prefer questions as we go along or at the end?
What I would say is, I was actually just going to mention that I think this would be a great idea if councilors, as they have questions, as I go through a slide, maybe wait till I get to the end of a slide, and then bring up the issue before I go on to the next slide. That's
Okay.
my thoughts.
Nope, that's fine. I just want to make sure so all
But
council knows.
I really appreciate, whatever questions they can make it much more interesting for people.
Okay, because we already have one question popping up already. So
Okay.
before you move on to the next slide, we'll go Councilor Rhino.
Well, it's really not a question. I guess it's an irk.
Yep.
It really irks me when there's a date there to have a motion to approve to council. I've been around this table for a long, long time, and I've said in a lot of budget discussions that went right from January, some going into June and later. And when I see staff put their motion to approve the budget, it looks like it's a directive, and I really take offense to that. If you had to put there further meetings if required, it would have been fine. But to me, that really irks me because I do believe that we have shortened this process up way too short, and it's just a race to get it done. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. I read it a little differently as, that's the hope, but everybody reads it, in their own way. Before we move on, CAO.
Through Mr. Chairman, I was just going to state, the date is the date that you have your last meetings. Council can always add more meetings to their calendar. This was based on the schedule that council approved. So that would be the date that we chose. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Councilor Rhino. I appreciate your comments, and I'll keep that in mind as we move forward. So as in previous years, I think the process has been fairly casual, and looking forward to questions from council members as we move along here. So any other questions before I move on to the next slide? No? Good? Okay. So this slide is really just a quick overview of the tax billing process here at East Hants. The big process is we're coming here together and we're talking about various issues in the budget, and we're talking about rates, and we hope to perhaps have a decision made sometime in March, or it might be later at some point. Once those decisions are made, we go forward and we prepare the interim tax bill, and it's posted and mailed normally in March. And those are due around June the 1st. And that first bill is just 50% of the previous year's budget. It's not based on the assessments for the current year. Final bill, however, takes that into account, so you have your final actual tax dollars less your interim bill, and that's what the final bill, which is due October 1st. And as PVSC said earlier, if residents have concerns about their assessments, it should be taken up with PVSC. I would say that it's also my observation that, from what I understand, East Hants is normally one of the first municipalities in the province to finish up their budget and tax rate decision process, which I think is, I think is good. I think it certainly has some financial benefits for that from the perspective of contracts getting in early, when contractors are not that booked solid. So I think that does have that advantage. Okay, that's that. Next slide. Again, we talked, we had an hour with PVSC, so this is really just restating a lot of the work that a lot of the information they provided. Our cap is at 3.2% this year, as opposed to 7.7 in the previous year. And it should be noted that PVSC actually did mail those out January 10th, so the assessments. So those are likely in the hands of residents, all the residents by now, I would say. Okay. Other types of revenue generating assessments. So besides the normal type of taxation where we have, an assessment of a value and it's relative, if there's a relative capped assessment and council decides to do or decides on a rate for that particular type of tax. There's also revenues that we get as a municipality, and these are not actually determined by the municipality itself, though. These are, for the most part, items that are stipulated by the province or in some cases, the federal government. So we don't actually have a direct say in what that revenue is going to be. Just for instance, some of these numbers here, this year we're looking at $43,000 for forest properties less than $50,000. Wind farms are providing $83,000 in revenue. Farm property, $135,000. Crown lands, $44,000. The grants in lieu from the, feds is $42,000, and the provincials is around $139,000. General tax rate. The general tax rate is, of course, probably the largest generator of revenue here for East Hants, and one that most people think of when they're thinking about tax rates that a municipality has. This slide tries to explain what are all of the services that are provided by the municipality or costs the municipality must incur that the general tax rate is covering. So as you can see, RCMP and other protected services, a variety of EMO, animal control. Another thing, education, regional libraries, some very significant costs there. PVSC that was just here. All the municipalities have to chip in and pay a share of the total operating costs for that. Of course, there's the whole general administration for, CAO, HR, corporate services, finance, information services, and a variety of other departments. Economic business development, parks, recreation, culture, planning and development, roads and operations. So there is a whole wide array of costs that are being covered by the general tax rate. Okay. Oh, I should note specifically that the general tax rate does not cover fire levies. It's not included in that rate. Waste management fee. Waste management fee is a general expense from the perspective that all of the taxpayers in the municipality are paying a waste management fee. The costs, relate to a variety of factors: recycling and compost, waste management center, household hazardous waste items, and at the moment, the dwelling units per unit fee that we charge is $220, and that is in the draft budget that we have in front of you. It's not changing at the moment. I would like to say, we do have actually a slide on that further down the road on waste management fees and the costs. Break-even costs, so I won't mention it here, but there is a slide later on that I'll talk about the fact that we're not actually at break-even costs at 220. It's actually higher than that, but there is a little bit of a story on that. Area rates. So area rates are charged based on an assessment of the property, and it's for services relating only to that specific area. So within our accounts, I mentioned earlier that there's actually budgets within budgets, and that's what I meant by area rates, specifically the GTR. So there's, within these area rates that we calculate and keep track of, in the records, there's income statement. We're tracking the revenue. We're tracking the expenditures relate to that in the fiscal year, and there's surplus and deficits that may have to go into or out of the reserve for that year. And as you can see, there's a few of these rates that are listed here: the urban service rate, the streetlights, the sportsplex, the Mount Uniacke recreation rate.
All right, we have a question from Councillor Mitchell.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The question deals with the waste management fee.
Mm-hmm.
Since there's a fee for residential units, I'm just questioning, I'm interested in how apartment buildings would be charged their fee.
So apartment buildings are charged, correct me if I'm wrong, CAO, but they're charged at the commercial rate. No, okay, I'm wrong. I'm going to let the CAO at that.
The apartment building, the residential assessment for apartment buildings.
So
So-
$220 per unit?
Yeah, so when we get the roll, they come on at, $3 million with 42 assessment or dwelling units. So they would get charged the $220 per unit.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Okay, urban service rate. The urban service rate, of course, charged per $100 of assessment. Shubenacadie and Milford pay a surcharge. Milford pays for wastewater through an area rate. Urban service rate covers things such as streetlights, sidewalks, hydrants, and there is a contribution that comes outside as well for areas R4, R5, and R6 in relation to streetlights and sidewalks in those areas. Also on wastewater management fee charged based on water consumption, not charged to homes in Milford as there's no water service in that area. This, the proposed budget that you have in front of you tonight is proposing a 20-cent increase from $2.20 per metric, cube metric, from $2.20 to $2.40 per cubic meter. Now, another point is the wastewater management fee is normally collected through the water bill. It's not part of your tax bill, normally, yeah. Let's see. Okay, Whoops, sorry. Talking about the assessment cap, there's some discussion with PVSC was here tonight. As you can see, this slide is demonstrating that because of the cap, there's been a taxable assessment loss in these relevant years. It's grown from 169 million up to $964 million in this current fiscal year. And that equates to, if at 23-24 rates, that would equal $7.8 million. The number of residents that are actually capped in East Hands are a rate around 83%. And that would represent approximately 23 cents on the tax rate that we have right now. So from the perspective of, if you were to change, remove the assessment cap, which of course is a provincial jurisdiction, we don't have a say in that, but if you were, we could reduce the actual rate down to 23 cents. But of course, the assessment would go back up. Yeah, so actually I just said that. My understanding is that the cap was introduced in 2005 to protect taxpayers who are seeing a sudden and dramatic increase in their property tax bills. And from that perspective, though, the tax burden from this program is being moved to new homeowners who are not initially in the cap, but as the years progress, they would actually be in the cap program. Sure. Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Wayne, this is your first year here, but every year somebody in your chair
Yeah.
talk about the assessment, the money lost due to the cap. It's
Yeah.
900 and some
Yeah.
$1 million.
Yeah.
And every year when I read the budget, it always come, we have to do it with zero surplus, zero deficit every year.
Yeah.
And every year we manage to use the previous rate, and we always come to that zero. So is there magic in there, or staff? I don't know how staff do it, but for me, I like to know how the whole budget process to come that zero at the end. You manage to spend like $39 million, or let's say $30 million that you know you're gonna get, and you always find a spot for it. Is there come with the CPI? Is that come with, I don't know. I would like to understand the whole thing.
So
like how you come up to that zero with the same rate, and you know that you have 300 or 400 million in extra assessment every year, like this year. This year, like we got a lot of new assessment,
Yeah.
and the assessment went up. Like the difference in assessment between this year and last year is huge, and we got almost $3 million, and that $3 million come to a zero at the end. So I would like to know how you guys do it.
I'm going to take a crack at that. I think the CAO might as well. But first, so it's a bit of a journey. So what the process here internally really starts in the fall, and we work with the finance department really works with the individual directors and managers to go over their budgets and talk about what their needs are and what we're expecting to happen in that fall. So we look at the expenditure side from that perspective, preparing for in the fall, and we know that PVSC is going to be providing us with these assessment numbers in December. So as soon as we get that, then we take those numbers from PVSC and try to input that into our system and the tax rates that we are currently using right now to tell us what is the revenue going to be that, bam, once you know that, you know what the revenue are, and you've been talking all along about the expenditures are. So you work all together and see at the end of the day, well, what you need to either cut or you need to put in reserves to make things balanced. Yes, absolutely, that is what we're doing. We're trying to bring a balanced budget to you, council. But we know it's not, in most cases, it's not gonna be the final number, so you'll make decisions, you don't wanna see that, you wanna see that. And then, so we have to play with, the tax rates or some of the other revenue numbers or expenditure numbers, because at the end of the day, we still gotta balance that down to zero. And we have to, I mentioned before that it's not just one operating budget, there's several budgets within that budget, because you've got your GTR rate, and you've got your USR budget, and then you've got these streetlight budgets, so there's several budgets within it, and all of them, you want to be either zero or, you're putting the funds towards reserve at the end of the year. So it's quite a process, and I'm gonna let the CAO talk, because I think she wants to have some
Okay,
comments.
CAO, go ahead.
Well, for his first time in the hot seat, Wade nailed it. That's, it is a process that we go through, and we establish our expenses first, and those revenues that come peripherally, like the waste revenues and whatnot. But the key piece that we need to do first is to look at those really big items that we have increases in. And to, sometimes we've had years where the RCMP and education go up by so much that there's no hope that we're going to decrease the tax rate. So we end up cutting either transfers to reserves, or we cut expenses, or, we'll look at like detransfer tax revenue and play with that a little bit. But we're always managing, before the document actually gets to council, we're managing that, and really it's my job to manage the level of risk that I think council is willing to take. And that's where you come with either a balanced budget, or maybe a cent increase or decrease, because over the years, listening to you make decisions and understanding how, what's important in your communities and all of those things, we're making decisions all along to get to this draft budget that we think your level of risk will accept. So then as we go through this process, we'll be sharing those with you. So we'll say things like, well, we recommend you increase your transfer to reserve of $100,000 for this. That's in this budget. So if you don't want to do that, that's when you can start to take it away. When we get to a point where we have such significant impacts on our general tax rate from RCMP and from education, so you can see on page 13 of the tax analysis in your document, there's all kinds of large impacts on these bottom lines. RCMP is $688,000. School board is $979,000. So they're really significant. So that is the primary. You get that out of the way, and then you're like, okay, well, what did we decide based on the council's strategic plan, based on inflation, based on all the expenses that we know, what should be in there for expenses? And then we have to say, okay, well, we either go to council with a budget that raises the tax rate, or we start to cut back some of those expenses and cut back some of those programs or whatever that might be. That's what we will tell you through this process, those decisions that we've made. So it might appear that we show up here with a magically balanced budget every year, but it's not magical. There's a lot of thought that goes into it. And once we get all of the input from all the departments, I sit down with finance and say, okay, how do we make this thing balance? And it might be that we change it's usually the reserves. Like that's usually where you can kind of bring it to balance. And we do that based on understanding council's level of risk and what you want to achieve. So, I've heard very loud and clear through some of your strategies you've approved that you want certain things in your communities. So we'll carry forward with that until you tell us not to. But really that final meeting between finance, once we have PBSC's information, that's when we sort of play with those numbers to make it balanced, but it's usually on how much you're transferring to and from reserves.
Thank you. It's nice to know. I just want to know how it works between everybody. And I know for myself and Councilor Rhino, we like to see a decrease in the rate always.
So would we.
Thank you.
Next up to speak, Warden.
I just want to echo a little bit what the CAO said, because intuitively, the public are looking and seeing the big increases in assessments and thinking, you're going to get so much more money over the assessment increase that we should have to pay less. But what they don't understand is, for example, education is based on a uniform assessment, which is based on assessment, and I won't get into all that. But as the CAO said, we're looking at almost $1 million increase over last year to what we are required to give the provincial government for education. And then the increases for the decisions we've made around the RCMP. And looking at all the other expenses that we as a municipality have, they're going up, the same as our personal expenses are going up. Insurance is up, I forget the percentage, but yeah, between 15 and 30%. You know, electricity is up, everything is up. And so it's not just a big extra bag of money that we got because the assessments increased, because although assessments increased, expenditures and expenses increased as well. And often that eats up the money that comes in from the increased assessment that would otherwise maybe have required a tax increase. So anyway, just thank you. From a layman's terms.
Thank you, Warden. Counselor Musa.
Yeah, thank you, Warden, for that explanation. And I ask that question because myself want to know, and I've been here for 8 years. That's for the people who's watching probably, and they always say, "Oh, my assessment went up. That's more money for East End." So it's nice for them to know exactly how we go and what we go through. And one more thing, though, you said the education is based on assessment, so certain percentage. So we know exactly what's going to be like as of.
It's a dollar value per $100 of assessment that are.
Yeah, so it's same as a fire department or anything like that.
30 cents, 30.4 cents.
Thank you. So and the policing is known too. So yeah, so we don't have to budget more for those, or can they come and they ask for more than what their percentage is?
Go ahead, CAO.
Through you, the policing one's a little bit different. We have some conversations with them. They haven't set their number yet, but we have a very good estimate, and we're usually within a few $1,000s in the way we estimate what that's going to be. So it's a little bit
But for
different.
the education, they cannot say we need more. Like
No.
it's based on
It-
assessment.
It's based on your assessment, which is based on last year's assessment growth. So last year, we did have this conversation that because we saw assessment growth go up last year, your uniform assessment that this year's calculation we based on would drive that cost up. I didn't actually think it was going to be $1 million, but here we are.
Yeah,
That will be the amount.
But if it go or no, that's their. We collected that money for them, so.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And it's based on how much your assessment goes up compared to everybody else. So we have historically been paying significantly more of that big pot in education because our assessments are going up.
Thank you.
Thank you, CAO. Counselor Tingley.
Question through the chair. Reading this documentation, is the overall assessment, my understanding, is going up when you take into consideration the cap, 10 or 11%? Is that correct? Actually, I thought it was 11.6% from where I read at one point.
It's actually on our next slide, and you're absolutely right. Yep.
No, it's just that we were into this discussion about, matching income with expenses. You know that a lot of things have gone up in the last year. Nothing's going down. So if we're only getting a 10% increase in revenue when you have more residents to serve, there's not a whole lot of room to play there. That's what I see anyway.
Thank you, Counselor. Warden, I have to ask you to take the chair for a moment because I have to step out.
Okay, no one else left for questions at this time, so we'll turn it back over to you, Wade.
Okay, thank you. So this next slide, we've actually talked about these numbers specifically at the January 16th meeting when we went over some preliminary budget information. So we have seen overall growth, net of exemptions, in assessments of 11.66%, residential 10.9, resource 15.4, and commercial 20.8, which was commercial 31.8 million increase over 2023. And when you look at the ratios of residential to commercial, we're at 93% versus 7%. This is actually the specific slide that we discussed at the January 16th meeting. And I would like to point out that our CEO had noted that during the PVSC presentation, they had presented some slightly different numbers for some of these assessments, and it's simply just a difference between how they presented some information in relation to properties that are exempt, such as nonprofits and municipal properties. So they're the same. There's just different ways of looking at it. That's all. Excuse me. Should say, it is, just noting here, we didn't really talk about this at the last meeting, but commercial did have a very significant increase in the taxable assessment of 20.85%. That's very significant. And a lot of that is related to the business park construction that's going on there. Some more comments on the assessments. Residential growth, again, 10.9%. The new assessment growth, 236 million. New properties, 33.8 million, which are 14% of the total growth. As far as new existing properties, 202 million, which is 86% of the growth in assessments, and we actually had 212 new dwelling units during the year. And of course, when we talk about residential assessments and the overall increase, we talk a lot about cap, but we got to remember that cap comes off when a property is sold, which increases the overall value. Okay, so increase in assessment net of exempt properties, commercial, community halls, not-for-profits, water utility, 20.85% this year, 31.8 million increase. At the draft budget document that we have in front of you, there is no rate change for the commercial assessment rate, or tax rate, sorry. This slide is simply showing you an extract of the top 10 commercial taxable assessments in this year. And as you can see here, Sobeys topping the list. This doesn't equate to actual, it doesn't equate to actual tax dollars coming in, however, because there's differences in some of these properties where they're relocated and the all-inclusive tax rate that they may or may not be paying compared to some of these other ones. Dwelling units. Dwelling units is a number that BVSC provides us to each year with the roll. As we were saying, we're up 212 units, and when you look at this slide here, it's telling you in the general area where they're coming from. Excuse me. Whoops. Okay. You can see here that a lot of them are in the Enfield, Elmsdale, Lance area. And there's also a lot in the Mount Uniacke area as well. This slide is just a simple bar chart showing 2023 in the green versus 2024 in the blue, the year-over-year change in each of the 11 districts. And as you can see, just by visually looking at these, 7 is a significant increase, as is District 9 as well. Some of the notes that we have here is that these increases are due largely to some of these subdivisions or in Seven Lakes in Clayton, Kiln Creek and District 7, East Uniacke, Grove Street, Heritage Way, and Loon Point in District 9, and in Rawdon, Parker Estates, District 11. This is showing you the distribution of dwelling units year over year. As you can see, we've kind of broken them out into different geographical areas. 23 numbers, the percentages, 24 numbers, and the percentages. And as you can see, in these groupings, there's been no change in the relative distribution of the over number of dwelling units. They're the same year to year. This is a bar chart showing the distribution of single dwellings by value for 2024. It's on the y-axis, you've got your percentage points over here, the actual assessment values on the bottom, and you've got the percentage of dwelling units in blue and the percentage of assessments in yellow for each of these. So just some conclusions from that. Dwelling units or dwellings valued at less than 200,000 make up about 52% of the total dwelling units and 28% of the assessment base. Conversely, dwelling units valued at more than 200,000 make 48% of the total dwelling units and 72% of the assessment base. So this is kind of going towards the question that Councillor Musa was talking about. And it's kind of going to the point, how do we get to that zero number at the end of the day? And so the 2.862 million that you see here represents what we as a municipality have to raise in this 24-25 year for the GTR expenditures to be able to balance based on the expenditures that we have. And so what happens is, to arrive at this number, or you theoretically arrive at it, and it is actually on page 13 of the budget and tax analysis document, you can see how this number is arrived by going through each of the individual sections of the budget and saying, okay, this year, or 23-23, we budgeted this, and 24-25, we budgeted this. The difference between the two numbers is this, and you keep on doing it for all the major areas of the budget, of the expenditure areas. And when you come to the bottom, at the end of the day, in this scenario that we've provided you for a budget draft at this point in time, to be able to balance that GTR budget, we have to find $2.862 million in revenue. Now, some of you that were here in the January 16th presentation that was the preliminary budget information. We provided you with a few numbers here. I actually talked at that point in time about what we had expected to generate in additional revenue. And I had referred to this earlier slide in that presentation. I had referred to this because we had that ready at that point in time. And I indicated at that point in time that because of these numbers, we're going to actually increase our revenue by $3.5 million from these numbers. I'd like to say I was wrong by stating that. I was off by about $700,000. Carried a decimal point to the wrong place. And so 3.5 less 0.7 is 2.8 million, is approximately what we raised because of the change in assessments staying at the same rate as we are presently. So going back here, you can see in these numbers, whoops, there it is there. So you can see here, revenue from the increase in assessment growth, keeping tax rates static would generate $2.845 million. So we're very close from that. Also, you should note that in 24-25, if we take and just move the general tax rate for residential by 1 cent, that would raise revenues by $247,000. And if we do the same for commercial, it would be about $19,980 based on the scenario that we have in front of us today. The draft that you have in front of us, or in front of you today, is assuming that no change in the residential tax rate, there's no change in the resource tax rate, there's no change in the commercial tax rate, and the waste management service fee, there's no change. It stays at $220 per dwelling unit. So earlier I mentioned about the waste management service fee, and I indicated that, I had another slide to talk about this. So when we look at our actual numbers for 24-25 for the waste management services, and we compare our revenue to what we're projecting our costs are, we're actually projecting right now that we should be charging $255 per dwelling to break even. Now, we're not recommending that you do that. The document that you have in front of you for a budget is actually drawing upon the reserves to the tune of $393,000 so that we don't have to do that this year. Now, the reason that we're not recommending that you change the $220 per dwelling unit is that we are expecting a significant increase in revenue for waste management stream in 25-26, the year right after this, which we think will be, we're talking about at the moment in the range of several $100,000. It's basically it's in relation to new agreements we have in place with manufacturers of producing items that need to pay their way in the stream. So I think it's called an EPR program. So we wouldn't want to increase the rate for 1 year, and then the next year you get all this new funding that's coming in, new money, and you're going to drop the rate down again. So the idea is use the reserves, which that's what reserves are for, to, one of the reasons for reserves is to balance and smooth tax rates, over time and avoid bumps. And this is a bump situation. And at the moment, the draft document is assuming that we would not increase it this year. This is just a pie diagram showing, various various aspects of the waste management cost breakdown, giving you an idea of where the big dollars are. Organics, waste, recycle, waste management center operations, and solid waste administration.
Okay, go ahead, CAO. You have something to add?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just going back to the the $390,000 coming in from reserves. So this is one of those areas that we talk about the risk. So we believe EPR is coming. We believe they'll get it figured out by the time you have your next budget. But bringing in that $393,000, yes, it keeps that rate at $220 per unit, but it does reduce your reserves by almost $400,000 for solid waste. So council really has to stop and think about that and say, do you really want to reduce those reserves by $400,000? Or do you want to start looking at maybe going halfway with that? Maybe you increase the rate by $10 instead of $25, or maybe you do something else, thinking ahead to the level of expenditures you have in the coming years for solid waste. If you choose to change the way you're doing things with organics, for example, or changes at the Waste Management Center, 3 or 4 years down the road, you may wish you still had that $400,000 in reserves. So the document's been drafted with that lens that you want to keep that tax burden low for your taxpayer, but we can't stress enough that that $400,000 will be coming out of reserve and just spent on operational dollars. So that's the kind of example that we were talking about earlier, that there are numbers in this budget that council really needs to weigh in on and make those fundamental decisions if that's what you want to do. We believe you probably did, so we drafted the budget that way, but you would need to understand the risk you're taking by doing that.
Thank you, CAO. Warden Rolson.
Thank you. And I know that part of those reserves were built up because for a number of years, the rate per household rate was, $5 or $10 more than break even, and we just put it in a reserve for situations like this. What I'd like to know is if we transfer that just under $400,000 out of solid waste reserves, how much is left in solid waste reserves?
I would ask Janice to have a gander at her reserve spreadsheet. Oh. That's way down here, I think. I'm on the slide now.
So certainly,
That's last year.
Yeah, no, this is as of last
that would
year.
certainly influence my appetite for risk.
Oh, no, I can put it on for you.
Just didn't know if they could hear me. The one thing that we were going to talk about in the slide was last year we decided that we were going to take $200,000 from reserves for the waste management fee, and based on projections to date, it looks like it's only $55 that we need to take from reserves. So that was one of the other comments that we were going to make, and I thought that was in the slide down further, but I'm not sure. So if we take $393,689 from reserves in 24-25, that still leaves $887,707 in reserves. So $887,000.
It sounds like a lot, but when you're talking solid waste, it's not. And EPR, whenever EPR comes on stream, will certainly make a difference. And I don't know if anyone has enough of an idea about EPR yet to even make a relatively educated guess. I think I did see a number somewhere of how much we thought we would get. Like, is it will be enough to start putting money hopefully back into that reserve. It will,
If I can answer that, I recall our discussions with the manager involved of that, talking minimum of $500,000 a year in revenues, and maybe significantly more.
so this year we're having to withdraw 393,000 plus. So when EPR comes on, assuming that solid waste expenses were static, we wouldn't have to withdraw from reserves, and we'd have a little bit to put back in. But the costs for solid waste probably won't be static. They'll probably continue to increase.
And we would hope too that the dwelling units would increase as well.
Yeah, okay.
So like, there's still growth in East Hants, right? So that's the other scenario that we have written.
Okay, well, I'll have to give some thought to that, because like everyone else, I don't want to increase the tax rate or increase the per household fee, but I don't want to hold the line this year so that in 2 or 3 or 4 years down the road, we have to increase it by $50, $60, or $100 to manage. Right now, off the top of my head, till I ponder it some more, I'm probably okay with the risk for this year. But once those EPR numbers are in, that might certainly change. Thank you.
Thank you, Warden. Next up to speak, Councilor Rhino.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not knowing a lot about this new program, and I'll be honest, but it's supposed to, what you say, bring in more revenue for the municipality. But is not the producer taking over more going to cost him more for the packaging in this too?
Go ahead, Sierra.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, there's a couple of different models, and I don't think Nova Scotia's really settled on what that model's going to look like. But essentially, they will end up paying for our recycling costs. That's the simplest way to put
Okay,
it.
so
So if we continue to do the recycling, they'll pay us. If they want to take over recycling collection, then they would just go collect recyclables, which is very confusing for the general public.
So again, I think we're missing the point. We may be getting more money as a municipality from this program, from what I can understand. The producers are gonna cost them more. So where do you think that they're going to recoup their costs? Their costs for their products are going up. So either way, we're gonna be paying, somebody's gonna be paying more, and it's gonna be the residents.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, the sentiment is we're already paying more because EPR is in place across the country. So all of the major producers of waste, of packaged goods, are already charging that in their costs, regardless of where it's going across the country. So Nova Scotians are already paying for EPR, although we're not getting the benefit from it until we sign these agreements.
So that we're getting, or everyone's paying it now, so maybe that's part of the cost of the products going up and
Right.
why we're into this inflation.
Right, and that has gone up across the country with all those major producers.
So somebody's gotta pay, when something, that's one of my point is, when somebody has to pay more, prices go up because it's always back on the consumer.
Yeah.
Thank you, Councilor. Seeing nothing else, continue on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Moving on to the next slide. So this is demonstrating how we're actually raising all the dollars that's needed. So the amount that we have to raise for the GTR to be balanced under the current model that we have is just over $27.6 million. And as we can see, again, with the model that we have in place, it's coming from 5.1 is from commercial in total revenue assessment or dollars. Residential, 19.5 million. Resource rate, 579,000. Waste management rate, $2.4 million, and all rounded up to $27.6 million. GTR over the past 5 years has declined. Starting 2019, it was 85.27, it's now at 81 under the proposed model, and of course, that may change before we're done this process. This slide is trying to indicate what a 1 cent raise by district would mean. So all the 11 districts are shown here. Remember earlier I talked about increasing the GTR by $1 would indicate or would grow our total revenue by about $247,000, and the same for commercial, it would be about $19,900. And you can see here from this analysis where those actual dollars are and the relevant percentages that they are of the total new revenues.
Okay, a couple questions here. First up, Warden Rolston.
Yes, and I'm not sure if this is the exact spot or not, but given the boundary changes that will be taking place before, well, in October when the election comes, currently each district has $2,000 a year in beautification money that they're able to give to the groups and organizations in their areas to help with mowing and, signage, maybe painting, plants, whatever. And a lot, particularly I think, because I'm more knowledgeable of the rural areas, a lot of those little community halls, cemeteries, et cetera, each one may now only get couple $100 a year or maybe less than that to help pay their mowing, but it's an important amount of money that helps them get these things done. And I know in other areas it goes towards those beautiful hanging baskets and that you see in some districts and different things. And my thought in particular was with the boundary, the revision to the boundaries. And I think in particular of the current District 5 and District 6. That's becoming a very huge district, which Kennecott is now moving into District 11. And there are some parts of District 5 going towards Shubenacadie. But for the most part, that's a very large rural area with just as many small little halls, organizations and everything, depending on that, however much, $150, $200 a year, whatever they get to help with their mowing and that. And now it's going to have to stretch twice as far, so to speak, because it's now going to be a lot of it one district. And there will be effects in the other areas, as well. The changes in 9 Mile River and Milford. The parts of Milford going back, it's going to make a difference. And maybe it is what it is, but I just think of the smaller organizations that are maybe counting on, and I'm just pulling numbers out of the air, $200 to help with their mowing for the summer. Now, because there's twice as many little halls or organizations in the area, they're only going to get 100 or 125, and it's challenging. So I'm wondering, I'm not saying we should double it or anything, but we haven't looked at this number for quite a number of years. And I wonder if maybe if we increase that to $3,000 a year instead of $1,000 a year, it would help mitigate the boundary changes, and it would also help mitigate the cost of everything going up for these small groups that have come to depend on this beautification money. And at an extra $1,000 per district, it's only $11,000 a year. I think we can find it somewhere without raising the tax rate. But it's just kind of something that I would like to see happen if it could, because I think it's not a grand sum in the big scheme of things, but for some of these smaller organizations, it does make a difference. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Warden. There's a number of people want to speak. First up, Councillor Rhino.
Yeah, so on the rural warden's point, I do agree that that's gonna have to be looked at, because at the very most, when these changes take place, that rural, has to be looked at, because it has to be split from, we went from 3 counselors to 2, or going to from 3 to 2, that there's gonna have to be blended in and taken into account for beautification funds and so on and so forth. And, that's what I say, we probably, to me, we should have opted for the other another counselor, but that's past tense now. So getting back to this, $248,000, so if we wanted to try to cut that rate, that's how much we'd have to cut out of the budget in some form, whether it be an HR position, whether that be a grant or something, or whether we cut back on the budgets within the each of the departmental budgets. But we could even be looking at a half a cent would be $124,000. So really, I think that's what we should be shooting for, because people are gonna be paying 7.7% more. It's crazy, because they're struggling to paying their heat bill, they're struggling paying food, lights, everything. So I think, we really gotta show some leadership, and it might hurt a little bit, but we gotta look hard to see what we can do for the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Next up, Counselor Musa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For next time, I know when a counselor from, let's say, Enfield, look at this, oh my God, I'm bringing 13%. But we have to look at, I wish we had how many dwelling units next to each in one square, because when you're talking about district, you have to know, like, we have some district that have 500 people more than the others now. Like, in my district, there's 1,700 people. There's some in Enfield, probably 2,200 people. So that percentage is coming from a whole district, but when you represent individual homes, that difference will be a lot smaller. And when the rural area combine together, that's gonna bring them up. So hopefully, I'm hoping we're gonna be, if not equal, like that difference in every district, what they bring to the general tax rate is gonna get closer and closer, because I know I'm gaining a lot of unit next year when the new boundary comes in. So those percentages are gonna get closer to each other. Just, I don't know if the CAO agree with me, or probably different,
ahead, CAO.
different idea.
I'm trying, just turning people off to turn people on. There we go.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. So this slide is an interesting slide, and really the reason it's in your budget presentation isn't to say, well, one gets 13% and one's more, or whatever. It does give that, and we could add the dwelling units to it. We could also add the number of acres your districts are. We could add all kinds of information to this to tell a different story. What this slide is in here for is, if you as a counselor are looking, one of the main reason is, if you as a counselor are looking to put an area rate in place for recreation, or do something that you need to know how much 1 cent raises in your community. So if you're looking at your Mount Uniacs and you say, well, if we added half a cent to our recreation rate, we're gonna bring in about $27,000 between our two districts. So, or 1 cent would be 52,000, or, so that's what I would intend this slide to be used for primarily. But as you get more information, there's all kinds of information we can add to it to sort of tell that different story.
Yeah, I understand that. I agree 100% with you, but on different topics, when different topics come and you combine those districts together, you try to sell us that some district bring 60% of something and 40% of something. So we should be looking at dwelling units in that too. So that's why I raise it, because you cannot compare district to district when you have 300 more units in one district that you have to service, more than the other, and you tell me that this district bring more. That's my point, like for another topics. But since that came here, I just like to mention it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Musa. Councilors, we've reached the time of adjournment. Actually, we're 6 minutes past the time of adjournment right now. There are 2 people left on to speak, and then after that, we'll be looking to wrap up tonight and to reconvene on Thursday. Final 2 people left to speak, starting with Warden Rolston.
Thank you. Following up on Councilor Musa, I know where he's coming from, and these charts, and they do exactly what the CAO said they do, but they also, they don't reflect things that have caused this. I mean, the corridor area has developed the way it's developed because of its proximity to the highway and to HRM. And so that's where the residential development is going to. You know, they want to be closer to those things. And I mean, had the rail line not been taken out and the railroad still ran through Kennecott, who knows what we'd be looking at, but that's the way it worked. And I sometimes think, I like it when I see slides that aren't as divisive. Because although homes in the rural area don't generate as much tax money because they're not assessed as highly, that's you know, there are a lot of factors that feed into that. And I've always looked at it to the point that the folks who live in the more outlying area may not be paying as much property tax as someone who's living in a more built-up area. They're not going to get as much out of their house if they sell it as someone. It's not as good an investment or as big an investment as some others are. But they're still paying more tax because they're paying a lot more to travel to work, and they're paying a lot more gas tax, and you know, they have to drive everywhere for their services. And so it always comes back to me that there's just one taxpayer out there, and the tax dollars come out of that taxpayer's pocket, and at the end of the day, he or she doesn't care if it's municipal, provincial, or federal that's getting his money. He just knows it's money that he doesn't have left in his pocket to spend. So, you know, I always take these charts with a bit of a grain of salt, because having been here for many years, I know that the rural areas will probably never generate as much money as those more built-up areas. And but the same point, those rural areas are the ones who supported the establishment of the business parks and everything from a general rate for the express purpose of bringing in more commercial dollars to the municipality. So it's, you know, it's kind of it's an interesting slide, and it is valuable because it tells you what a cent would raise on an area rate. But on the other hand, you know, I'm not always, same as Councilor Moose, I'm not always sold on the picture it presents. Thank you.
Thank you, Warden. Councilor Tingley.
Through the chair, I mentioned in the last meeting that I'm going to be going away to New Zealand on a vacation, and I think I need to make a motion so I'm going to move to recommend that council allow that I take a leave from council to travel to New Zealand from February 12th, 2024 to March 19th, 2024. And I can attend the meetings from there virtually if you like, but I'd like to make that motion to get your permission to do this.
Seconded.
Moved and seconded. Is there any discussion?
Question.
Question's been called on the motion. The votes are in, and the motion is passed, with Councilor Rhino voting nay. Councilor Rhino, I did see you at the last second on before the vote. Would you like to speak?
I've got one other thing I want to say.
I just have to see because there was a motion and
I
I
see.
missed
Okay.
him. I saw you light up. Would you like to speak?
No, I voted against it because I do not think that, I do not agree with people burrowing in through the internet to Lincoln in these meetings. So that's why I voted against it.
Okay, Counselor. All right, go ahead, Counselor Tingley.
Okay, through the chair, I'm not sure if this is the time to raise this, but Counselor Mitchell and myself attended a Sportsplex meeting last night, and it's some of the things that come up, their $100,000 line of credit is pretty well to the max. They're postponing some bills that they're paying, like one of them is their electric bill. They're getting permission from the Power Corporation to delay payment of that because they just don't have the cash flow.
I think the Sportsplex and those rates, dealing with those topics, are on the agenda for a later date. So that's the time to bring up the issues with the Sportsplex.
I might not be at the meeting.
Counselor Mitchell can be here.
Okay, because it is, I think council need to deal with something here, but that's all right.
Yeah, no, it's
Okay.
just, we're, through the budget process, we're gonna try and keep everything as per the schedule. We'll discuss it then, and then at the end, we have a chance to revamp everything.
Thanks very much.
All right. Seeing nothing further, looking for a motion to adjourn to reconvene on Thursday, February 1st at 7 o'clock for a second budget meeting. Moved and seconded? All those in favor? Aye.